September 1943, Northern Ontario, Canada. The train wheels screeched against the rails as they slowed. Hans Miller pressed his face against the cold window, trying to see where they were taking him. Trees. Nothing but trees. Pine and spruce stretching forever in every direction. No buildings, no roads, no civilization. Just endless green forest under a gray September sky. The boxcar smelled like sweat and fear. 80 men packed together, hands cuffed in front of them, sitting on wooden benches. They had been on this train for 3 days, moving north from the coast where the prison ship landed. Hans was 24 years old, a soldier in the Wehrmacht, captured 5 months ago at Monte Cassino in Italy. He had been told he was going to a prison camp in Canada. He expected barbed wire, machine gun towers, guard dogs, beatings. That was what prisoners of war received. That was what he had been taught. Beside him sat Ernst Weber, a 32-year-old veteran of the Afrika Korps. Ernst's face was hard and weathered, his eyes cold. He had fought in North Africa for 2 years before British forces captured him. Ernst was a true believer. He wore his Nazi ideology like armor. Even here, defeated and captured, he sat straight, jaw clenched, refusing to show weakness. Across from Hans sat Klaus Schmidt, barely 19 years old. The boy still had soft cheeks, eyes that looked too young for war. He had been conscripted only 8 months ago, sent to Sicily, captured almost immediately. Klaus was scared. Hans could see it in how the boy's hands shook, how his eyes darted around the boxcar like a trapped animal. The train stopped. Guards shouted in English. The doors opened, flooding the dark boxcar with light. Canadian soldiers stood outside with rifles, but the weapons hung loosely from their shoulders. They did not point them. They did not yell threats. One guard was smoking a cigarette, looking bored. "Out! Line up!" the guard shouted in broken German. The prisoners climbed down from the train, blinking in the afternoon light. Hans looked around. This was the prison camp? A collection of simple wooden buildings surrounded by a fence that looked like it could barely keep chickens in. No barbed wire, no guard towers with machine guns, no dogs. Just a wooden fence maybe 8 feet high, and beyond it, forest stretching to the horizon. The men stood in rows while a Canadian officer counted the new arrivals. 80 prisoners from the train. The officer checked his clipboard and spoke to another guard. Camp total is now 180. Hans did the math in his head. 180 prisoners. Maybe 12 guards total. That was 15 prisoners for every guard. In German camps, there were more guards than prisoners. Here, the prisoners outnumbered the guards by far. A man approached who did not look like a soldier. He wore work clothes, heavy boots, a flannel shirt. He looked like a farmer or a laborer. He spoke to them in German with a thick accent. "I am Foreman Peterson. You will work in the lumber camp. You will cut trees. You will follow rules. You will be treated fairly according to the Geneva Convention. Follow orders and you will be fine. Try to escape and you will die in the forest." Questions? No one spoke. The prisoners were taken to their barracks. Simple wooden buildings with rows of bunk beds. The beds had real mattresses, real blankets. Hans touched his mattress, confused. It was soft, clean. In German barracks, soldiers often slept on wooden boards with thin blankets. That evening, they were fed dinner. Hans stared at his plate in disbelief. Pork, real pork, a thick slice of it, mashed potatoes with butter, bread that was actually bread, not sawdust mixed with flour, green beans, a cup of milk, coffee with real sugar. He had not seen food like this since before the war. In Germany, civilians were starving. Soldiers got better rations, but even those were thin. Meat once a week if they were lucky. Bread that was half substitute ingredients. coffee made from roasted acorns. Here, on his first night as a prisoner, he ate better than he had eaten in 2 years as a free German soldier. Ernst ate slowly, mechanically, his face showing nothing, but Hans saw his eyes. Ernst was just as shocked as everyone else. He just refused to show it. Klaus ate like a starving dog, shoveling food into his mouth until tears ran down his face. "Why?" he whispered. "Why do they feed us like this?" No one had an answer. The next morning, after breakfast, that was just as good as dinner, Foreman Peterson took the new prisoners to a large wooden shed. He unlocked the door and opened it wide. Hans stepped closer and looked inside. His heart stopped. Axes. Dozens of double-bladed axes hanging on the walls. 2-man crosscut saws, 6 feet long with teeth like a shark. Wedges, sledgehammers, mauls, sharp tools, heavy tools, tools that could crack a man's skull open, tools that could cut through flesh and bone. Foreman Peterson walked into the shed and started pulling down axes. He handed one to Hans. The handle was smooth wood, well maintained. The blade was sharp. Hans could see his reflection in the steel. He gripped the handle. It felt good in his hands, solid, deadly. Peterson handed an axe to Ernst, then to Klaus, then to every prisoner in the line. 80 men, all holding weapons. The guards stood back. The nearest guard was 50 yards away, leaning against a tree, smoking a cigarette. His rifle hung from his shoulder. He was not even watching them. Hans looked at the axe in his hands. He looked at the guard. He could throw this axe and kill that man before the guard even reached for his rifle. 80 prisoners with axes and sledgehammers against 12 guards. They could take this camp in minutes. Foreman Peterson spoke again in his broken German. "You will clear Section 12 of the forest. Your quota is 2 cords of wood per man per day. Cut the trees. Stack the logs. Do your work and you get privileges. Good food. Mail from home. Maybe even small payment. Fall behind and you lose privileges. Simple." He pointed toward the endless forest. "Try to escape if you want. Nearest town is 80 miles that way. No roads, no trails. Just forest. Bears out there. Wolves. Winter's coming. Temperature drops to 30 below zero. You will freeze to death or starve. Maybe both. Your choice." He turned and walked away. Just walked away. Left 80 armed prisoners standing there with axes in their hands. Hans stood frozen. His fingers gripped the axe handle so tight his knuckles turned white. This made no sense. None of it made sense. Guards were supposed to beat prisoners, starve them, watch them constantly, treat them like dangerous animals. These Canadians fed them like guests and handed them weapons. Ernst stood beside him, holding his axe, staring at the guard who was still smoking his cigarette 50 yards away. Ernst's face showed nothing, but his breathing was fast, shallow. "They're either incredibly stupid," Ernst whispered, "or incredibly confident." Klaus looked at his axe, then at Hans, his young face full of confusion and fear. "What do we do?" Hans did not know. He had been trained to fight, trained to follow orders, trained to believe that enemies were cruel and weakness meant death. But these Canadians did none of what he expected. They fed him, trusted him, handed him an axe, and walked away. Around him, the other prisoners stood just as confused. Some gripped their axes like weapons. Others held them loosely, uncertain. Everyone was thinking the same thing. We could fight. We could escape. We have the tools. We outnumber them. But where would they go? Into a forest that stretched 2,000 square miles, with no roads, no towns, no shelter? With winter coming? With wolves and bears? The guard finished his cigarette, dropped it on the ground, crushed it with his boot. Still did not look at the prisoners. Just started walking back toward camp like 80 armed enemy soldiers were were no threat at all. Hans took a deep breath. He looked down at the axe in his hands. A tool or a weapon? That was the choice. Build or destroy, work or fight, trust or betray. For the first time since his capture, Hans Müller was not sure what the right answer was. The days became weeks. The weeks became months. And with each passing day, Hans Müller discovered something new that made no sense according to everything he had been taught. The food never stopped being shocking. Every meal had meat. Not thin slices or small portions, but real meat. Breakfast included eggs, bacon, toast with butter. Lunch was sandwiches with thick slices of ham or beef. Dinner brought pork chops or roast chicken or beef stew with chunks of actual beef floating in rich gravy. Vegetables at every meal. Real coffee, not the fake coffee made from acorns that Germans drank. Milk, fresh and cold, whenever they wanted it. Hans remembered 1942 in Germany. His mother's letters described standing in line for hours to get bread that was half sawdust. Meat rations were 8 ounces per week for civilians. 8 ounces. Here, Hans ate 4 pounds of meat every week. He was a prisoner, an enemy, yet he ate 5 times better than free German citizens. He started keeping a diary, writing in a small notebook he traded for with another prisoner. It was against the rules, but no one searched their belongings. He wrote down every meal, every strange thing he saw, trying to make sense of it all. One afternoon in October, Hans watched Klaus walk to the garbage bins behind the kitchen. A Canadian guard had just thrown away a sandwich, half of it barely touched. Klaus looked around to make sure no one was watching, then pulled the sandwich from the trash. The bread was soft, white, fresh baked that morning. The meat inside was thick sliced ham with real cheese, mustard, lettuce. Klaus held the discarded sandwich in both hands, staring at it like it was treasure. In Germany, this would feed a family for 2 days. Here, a guard threw it away because he was full. Klaus took a bite, then another. Tears ran down his face as he ate garbage that was better than anything his family had seen in years. Hans turned away, feeling something twist in his chest. Something was deeply wrong, but he could not figure out what. The work itself revealed more impossible things. The lumber operation was like nothing Hans had ever seen. In Germany, men cut trees with handsaws and axes. It took hours to drop a single large tree. Here, the Canadians had machines, gasoline-powered chainsaws that screamed through wood like a hot knife through butter. A single man with a chainsaw could drop a tree in 15 minutes. Trucks arrived every day to haul logs. Big trucks with powerful engines that never seemed to run out of fuel. They made trip after trip, engines roaring, carrying loads that would have taken 50 horses to pull. There was a narrow-gauge railway running through the forest. A small train that carried logs to the mill. Electric lights powered by a diesel generator lit up the camp at night, bright as day. Ernst watched it all with eyes that grew harder and colder each day. One evening, he sat beside Hans at dinner, eating in silence. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. I spent 2 years in North Africa, 2 years watching panzers run out of fuel and get abandoned. We had tanks that could beat any British tank, but no fuel to run them. Men died because we could not get supplies. We lost battles because trucks broke down and we had no parts to fix them. The Afrika Korps fell because we had no fuel, no ammunition, no food. Ernst stabbed his fork into a thick slice of pork. Here, their trucks run all day, every day. The generator runs all night. The chainsaws burn gasoline like water. They have so much fuel, they waste it. One of these trucks could have saved an entire panzer division in Tunisia. One. He ate his pork slowly, mechanically. His face showed nothing, but his hands shook slightly. After 6 weeks, Foreman Peterson took a group of 20 prisoners into a nearby town for supplies. Hans was chosen to go. They loaded onto a truck, still no handcuffs, no chains. Just men riding in the back of a truck with one guard. The town was small, maybe 2,000 people. Clean streets, nice houses, shops with windows full of goods. People walked around freely, smiling, talking. Children played in yards. It looked like a place where no war had ever touched. The truck stopped at a general store. As the prisoners climbed down, people stopped to look. Hans expected anger, hatred, spit, and stones. These Canadians had sons and brothers fighting Germans in Europe right now. Some of those sons and brothers were probably dead because of soldiers like him. An elderly woman walked up to them. She was maybe 70 years old, gray hair, kind face. She carried a basket of apples from her yard. She offered them to the prisoners. Real apples, red and fresh. "You boys look hungry," she said in English that Hans barely understood. But he understood kindness. It was in her eyes, her smile. She gave each prisoner an apple. A shopkeeper's daughter, maybe 16 years old, waved at them from across the street. She smiled. Just smiled and waved like they were normal people, not enemy soldiers. Nobody spit, nobody threw stones, nobody shouted. These people treated them like human beings. On the ride back, Hans bit into his apple. It was sweet and crisp. He could not remember the last time he had eaten fresh fruit. During a work break, Corporal Morrison, one of the guards, sat down next to Hans on a log. Morrison was maybe 30 years old. Friendly face, always treated the prisoners with respect. He offered Hans a cigarette. They smoked together in silence for a moment. "You got family?" Morrison asked, in simple English that Hans could understand. "Mother, sister, Bavaria." Morrison pulled out his wallet and showed Hans a photograph. A pretty woman with 2 small children. "My wife, Sarah. My kids, Tommy and Anne. Tommy's 4. Anne just turned 2. He put the photo away carefully, looked at Hans like he was a person, not a number, not an enemy, just another man far from home. Hans did not know what to say. In Nazi ideology, enemies were subhuman. They were things to be destroyed, not people to share cigarettes with. Yet here was Corporal Morrison, treating him with more kindness than German officers had shown their own men. December arrived with snow and bitter cold. A supply truck came to the camp carrying Christmas provisions. The prisoners gathered to watch as guards unloaded boxes, cases and cases of bottles with red labels, Coca-Cola, hundreds of bottles. The camp commander announced that each prisoner would receive 2 bottles for Christmas. Hans stood in line with the others, watching men receive their Coca-Cola like it was gold. He had heard of Coca-Cola, this American drink that Nazi propaganda mocked as a symbol of capitalist excess and waste. A guard handed him 2 cold bottles. Hans held them, feeling their weight, seeing the condensation form on the glass. He opened one, the fizz, the bubbles, the sound. He took a drink. The taste exploded in his mouth, sweet, cold, carbonated, like nothing he had tasted in years. The sugar, the flavor, the refreshment. It was more than a drink. It was a symbol of abundance, of a world where such things were common enough to give away to prisoners. Klaus stood beside him, drinking his Coca-Cola with wide eyes. How can they give this to us? We are their enemies. Their soldiers are fighting and dying because of us. How can they have so much that they give it away to prisoners? Ernst said nothing. He held his bottles but did not open them. He just stared at them, his hard face cracking just a little. Hans saw something in Ernst's eyes he had never seen before. Doubt. That night, Hans wrote in his diary by the light from the electric bulbs that never turned off. I was told Canadians were soft, weak, lacking discipline, that their society was failing because they showed mercy instead of strength. But I see men who work harder than us, even though they have everything. I see a system that wastes nothing, despite having abundance we cannot imagine. I see strength through restraint rather than cruelty. They hand us axes, no guards watching. They trust us not to kill them. The Führer said trust was weakness. But which system is truly weak? The one that needs whips and guns and fear to maintain order? Or the one that hands enemies weapons and trusts them to choose correctly? I do not have answers yet, but the questions are growing louder every day. Outside, snow fell silently on the Canadian forest. Inside, German prisoners slept in warm beds with full stomachs, guarded by men who treated them like human beings. And slowly, invisibly, something was beginning to break. Not their bodies, something deeper, something that once broken could never be put back together the same way. Their certainty. Christmas Day, 1943. Hans woke early in the morning to the sound of activity outside. Through the frost-covered window, he saw guards carrying boxes into the dining hall. Green branches, decorations. Something was different about today. At breakfast, the camp commander stood at the front of the hall. Major Thompson was a tall man with gray hair and a serious face. He cleared his throat and spoke in surprisingly good German. Gentlemen, you are far from home today. Many of you have families you miss. Mothers, fathers, wives, children. We are at war, yes. You are our prisoners, yes. But we recognize your humanity. We remember that you are men, not animals. Today is Christmas, a day of peace, a day of hope. So today, we celebrate peace on earth, even if that peace must wait for better days. Merry Christmas. The dining hall fell silent. Hans felt something tighten in his throat. The guards began bringing out food. Hans stared. He could not believe what he was seeing. Roast turkey, golden brown, the skin crispy and perfect. Ham glazed, with something sweet that smelled like honey. Mountains of mashed potatoes with rivers of gravy. Vegetables cooked in butter, dinner rolls soft and warm, and pies. Apple pies and pumpkin pies with crusts that looked like they came from a bakery. Real coffee steamed in big pots, not ersatz coffee. Real coffee that smelled like heaven. The servers placed plates in front of each prisoner. Hans looked down at his plate. It was loaded with more food than he had seen in 3 years. His hand shook as he picked up his fork. Around him, the other prisoners sat frozen. Some stared at their food. Others looked at each other, confusion and disbelief on their faces. Klaus, the young soldier, started crying silently, tears running down his cheeks as he looked at his plate. Ernst sat across from Hans, jaw clenched tight, staring at the feast in front of him. For 20 minutes, Ernst did not touch his food. He just sat there, rigid, refusing. But Hans could see the battle happening inside him. Finally, slowly, Ernst picked up his fork. His hands were shaking. He took a bite of turkey, then another. He was trembling now, this hard man who had survived North Africa, who believed so strongly in Nazi ideology that he wore it like armor. The armor was cracking. Hans ate slowly, tasting every bite. The turkey was moist and tender. The gravy was rich. The mashed potatoes were creamy with real butter. He thought of his mother in Munich, standing in line for hours to get a single loaf of bread mixed with sawdust. He thought of his sister, working 12-hour shifts in a munitions factory for rations that would not fill a child's stomach. And here he sat, a prisoner, an enemy, eating a feast that German civilians could not imagine. After dinner, Corporal Morrison brought out a gramophone and set it on a table. He placed a record on the turntable. Music filled the hall. German music, Christmas carols from home. O Tannenbaum played first, then Stille Nacht, Silent Night. Grown men wept openly. Hans felt tears on his own face. He was not alone. All around him, soldiers cried. They cried for homes they might never see again. They cried for families who might be dead. They cried because Canadians, their enemies, showed them more humanity than their own government had shown them in years. Ernst put his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. This man who never showed weakness was breaking. That night, Hans could not sleep. He lay in his bunk, staring at the dark ceiling, thinking. Finally, he got up, turned on a small lamp, and pulled out his diary. He wrote for 2 hours, the words pouring out of him. I understand now what we lost, what we destroyed. The Führer told us that kindness was weakness, that mercy made nations vulnerable, that only strength and cruelty could build a great society. But these Canadians are strong, not despite their kindness, but because of it. They defeated us in battle. They captured us, and now they treat us better than our own government treated us as free men. I think of my mother, starving in Munich. I think of my sister, working in a factory for bread and margarine. I sit here, a prisoner, eating turkey and pie. Something is deeply wrong with what we were told. They give us axes. We could kill them. We could try to escape. But where would we go? Back to what? To a Germany that is starving and burning and dying? To a regime that sent millions to death camps while telling us we were the master race. I do not know what I will find when I return home, but I know this. The greatest prison was not here in Canada. It was in my own mind, in the lies I believed, in the propaganda that told me compassion was weakness and cruelty was strength. He paused, thinking about how to end his entry. Finally, he wrote one more paragraph. The Canadians hand us axes and walk away. That is their test. Not of our strength, but of our choice. Will we use these tools to destroy or to build? Every day, we choose to build. And every day, that choice changes us a little more. In the weeks after Christmas, Klaus approached Hans with a question. The young soldier held a form in his hands, his face nervous but excited. The International Red Cross offers correspondence courses. We can study while we are here. I want to take English lessons. I want to study Canadian history. He looked at Hans with young eyes full of hope. I want to understand how they built this, how a country can be so rich, so free, so... He struggled to find the word. So decent. Hans helped him fill out the form. Within a month, Klaus was studying every night, learning English, reading about democracy and freedom and rights. He was not the only one. Prisoners lined up to take courses. Mathematics, engineering, languages, agriculture, skills they could use after the war. Ernst changed, too, but he refused to admit it. He never talked about the Christmas dinner, never mentioned the tears, but his actions betrayed him. He volunteered for extra work details, staying late to help finish projects. When a guard's radio broke, Ernst asked if he could fix it. He spent 3 evenings working on it, using skills he learned as a mechanic in the Afrika Korps. When he handed the working radio back, the guard tried to pay him. Ernst refused. A new prisoner arrived in February, straight from capture, still full of Nazi ideology. At dinner, the new prisoner started speaking loudly about how Germany would win, how the Führer was a genius, how the master race would prevail. Ernst walked over to him. His voice was low and hard. Shut up and eat your food. You do not know anything yet. The new prisoner started to argue. Ernst leaned close. Eat your food. Do your work. Keep your mouth shut. You will learn. We all learned. Now be quiet. By spring of 1944, something strange happened. The German prisoners were outproducing the Canadian civilian workers, not because anyone forced them to, not because they were beaten or threatened. They worked hard because they were proud of their work. Hans realized something that shook him to his core. Nazi ideology claimed that Aryan superiority would naturally lead to excellence, that Germans were the master race, destined to rule because they were simply better. But here, in this camp, German prisoners performed better as respected workers than they ever had as ideological slaves. They did not work hard because of Nazi ideology. They worked hard because they were well fed, well treated, and given dignity. The master race needed freedom and humanity to unlock their potential, not speeches about blood and soil. The numbers told the story. In the first month, 3 prisoners tried to escape. All 3 returned voluntarily within days, half frozen, realizing that freedom meant nothing if you died alone in the wilderness. After that, no one tried to escape. Productivity increased by 240% over 18 months. The prisoners were cutting more wood, working more efficiently, and maintaining better quality than anyone expected. When the war neared its end and prisoners were asked if they wanted to return to Germany or immigrate to Canada, 68 men out of 180 chose to stay. More than 1 in 3 prisoners wanted to stay in the country that captured them. 124 prisoners enrolled in correspondence courses. They studied at night after work, improving themselves, learning skills, preparing for a future that did not include Nazi Germany. The camp kept records of everything. Daily calorie intake for each prisoner, 3,200 calories. Hans learned that German civilians back home were rationed 800 calories per day, often getting less. German soldiers got 2,400 calories if they were lucky. Prisoners of war in Canada ate better than anyone in Germany. The camp stored 8 tons of food at any time. Weekly meat ration per prisoner, 4 pounds. Weekly meat ration for German civilians, 8 ounces. The prisoners ate 5 times more meat than free Germans. Hans sat on a log one evening in April, watching the sunset over the forest. Klaus sat beside him, studying his English textbook. Ernst was nearby, fixing a broken saw, his hands working carefully, precisely. "We were told we were the master race," Hans said quietly, "that we were superior, that our system was the future." Klaus looked up from his book. "What do you think now?" Hans watched Ernst work, this hard man who had believed so completely and now said nothing but showed everything through his actions. He thought about the Christmas feast, the axes handed out with no guards watching, the trust given when hate would have been easier. "I think we were prisoners long before we came here," Hans said. "Prisoners of lies. And maybe the only way to become free was to first become prisoners of men who understood freedom better than we did." Klaus nodded slowly and went back to his English lessons. Ernst kept working on the saw, and Hans sat in the fading light, feeling something inside him that had been broken finally start to heal. The war was not over yet, but for these men, something had already ended, and something new, something better had quietly begun. May 1946, Hamburg, Germany. Hans Müller stepped off the repatriation ship onto German soil for the first time in nearly 4 years. The gangplank swayed under his feet. Other former prisoners walked beside him, their faces pale, their eyes wide. They were home, but home did not look like home anymore. Hamburg was gone, not damaged, not broken, gone. Block after block of rubble stretched in every direction. Buildings reduced to piles of broken brick and twisted metal. Walls stood alone with nothing behind them, like stage props for a play about the end of the world. Craters filled with stagnant water dotted the landscape. The smell hit Hans like a physical blow. Death, sewage, smoke, rot. People moved through the ruins like ghosts. Women in rags picked through rubble, looking for anything useful. A piece of wood, a brick that was not broken, a scrap of metal. Children with hollow eyes and distended bellies watched the prisoners walk past. Their faces were old. Children should not have faces that old. An old man approached Hans, hand outstretched, begging. "Cigarettes? Please? Anything?" Hans looked at the man's face and felt his heart stop. Herr Fischer, his former schoolteacher, a man who had been dignified and proud, who wore suits and ties and taught literature. Now he wore rags. His face was a skull with skin stretched over it. His eyes were desperate and wild. "Herr Fischer?" Hans whispered. The old man squinted, trying to focus. "Do I know you?" "Hans Müller. You taught me in 1936. Recognition flickered. "Little Hans? You are alive?" "Yes, sir." "Do you have cigarettes? Food? Anything?" Hans swung his rucksack off his shoulder. The Canadian guards let him pack supplies before he left. He opened the bag, chocolate bars, canned meat, coffee, real coffee, soap. He started pulling things out, handing them to Herr Fischer. A crowd formed instantly. People appeared from nowhere, pressing close, hands reaching. Hans gave away everything: chocolate, meat, coffee. They clutched the items like treasure. Some wept, some kissed the cans. One woman held a bar of soap to her chest and sobbed. Hans kept walking through the ruins with an empty rucksack. His feet knew the way to his family's house, even though nothing looked familiar. He turned corners where street signs no longer existed. He walked down streets where buildings had stood for 300 years and now stood no more. His family's apartment building was still standing, barely. The top 2 floors were gone, blown away by bombs. The remaining floors looked ready to collapse. Hans climbed the stairs, his boots echoing in the empty stairwell. The door to his family's apartment hung crooked on one hinge. He pushed it open. "Mama?" A woman stood by the window, backlit by gray light. She was so thin Hans could see the outline of her bones through her dress. Her hair was gray, her face lined with wrinkles. She looked 70 years old. His mother was 52. She turned slowly, squinting at him in the dim light. For a long moment she did not recognize her own son. Then her hand flew to her mouth. "Hans! My Hans!" "Yes, Mama. I am home." She moved toward him, slowly, like someone much older. She touched his face with trembling fingers. "You are healthy. You have flesh on your bones. They fed you." "Yes, Mama, they fed me." She started crying, touching his arms, his chest, checking that he was real. "We were told you were dead. We were told all prisoners were being tortured, starved, worked to death. We were told the enemy was inhuman." She could not finish. She just held him and cried. That evening they ate dinner together. Thin soup made from potato water and a few vegetables Hans found at a black market, using the Canadian wool blanket he brought as trade. His mother ladled the soup into cracked bowls with shaking hands. She kept looking at him, tears in her eyes. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me what happened." Hans pulled out his diary. It was forbidden for prisoners to keep diaries, but he had hidden it carefully, and the Canadians never searched for it. He read passages out loud. The Christmas feast, the axes handed out with no guards, the Coca-Cola, the correspondence courses, the trust. His mother listened, soup forgotten, tears streaming down her face. "We were told our prisoners were being tortured. We were told you were suffering, and all along," she stopped, unable to continue. "All along," Hans said quietly, "we were the ones being lied to." His younger brother, Otto, came home later. Otto had spent the war in a youth labor camp, digging ditches and building fortifications. He was 19 now, thin and angry. He listened to Hans's stories with a dark expression. Propaganda, Otto said. They are lying to demoralize us, to make us hate ourselves. Hans shook his head. I was there, Otto. I lived it. Every word is true. Then we should have fought harder. We should have won. We were the master race. The Führer said so. Hans looked at his brother's angry young face. The master race is starving in ruins. The inferior Canadians are rebuilding their cities and feeding their families. Which one was the lie? Otto had no answer. He left the apartment, slamming the broken door. Over the next months, Hans tried to find work. There was no work. Hamburg was destroyed. The economy was destroyed. People traded possessions for food. Hans used his Canadian work boots to trade for food for his mother. He used his carpenter skills, learned in the POW camp, to help neighbors repair buildings. But Germany was dying. The cities were rubble. The people were starving. The future looked like endless gray misery. In 1951, a letter arrived. The Canadian Immigration Office was offering expedited visas to former POWs with good conduct records. Haynes qualified. The letter included an application form. He sat at the kitchen table with his mother, holding the letter. I could go, Mama. I could build a life there. Send money back to help you. His mother took his hand. Her fingers were thin and cold. Go, my son. Go where there is hope. Do not stay in this graveyard. 6 weeks later, Hans boarded a ship with his new wife, Anna, and their infant son. They sailed across the Atlantic toward Canada, toward the place where he had once been a prisoner, toward the place that became more home than home. He settled in Ontario, 90 miles from the camp where he had been held. He became a carpenter, using skills learned as a POW. He built houses, good houses that stood strong and lasted. He built a life. Klaus had a different story. The young soldier who took correspondence courses in the camp graduated from a Canadian university in 1952. He became a teacher in Toronto. He taught history and civics to German immigrants. When asked why, he said, I learned in a prison camp what freedom really means. I want to make sure no one forgets. Ernst returned to Germany and never spoke of his POW experience. He tried to pretend it never happened, but his children noticed things. He refused to attend any neo-Nazi gatherings. He quietly voted for Democratic parties. Once, when drunk, he told his oldest son, the strongest thing I ever saw was a man who did not need to prove his strength with cruelty. The numbers told a bigger story. Of the 35,000 German POWs held in Canada during the war, approximately 6,000 returned after the war as immigrants. They came back to the country that captured them. They became citizens. They raised families. They contributed to society. They chose Canada over Germany. The POW labor program had helped keep Canada's economy running during wartime. The humane treatment worked better than brutality. It cost less, produced more, and created future citizens instead of future enemies. The former POWs became ambassadors for democracy in post-war Germany. They wrote letters home describing what they saw. They explained how democracy worked, how freedom felt, how abundance was possible without conquest. They planted seeds that helped Germany rebuild as a democracy instead of another dictatorship. In 1985, at age 66, Heinz Miller sat in his living room in Ontario, being interviewed for a documentary about World War II POWs. The camera was on. The interviewer, a young woman, asked her question, "What did you really learn in that camp? What was the most important lesson?" Hans thought for a long moment. His carpenter's hands rested on his knees. hands that built things, hands that chose to build instead of destroy. They handed me an axe, he finally said. No chains, no guards nearby, just trust. And I understood something then that the Führer never could. Real strength does not come from making people afraid of you. It comes from making them not afraid. The Nazis ruled through terror and called it power. The Canadians ruled through trust and proved what power really was. We were told that showing mercy made you weak, that kindness was foolish, that only dominance mattered. But the Canadians were kind and they won. We were cruel and we lost everything. That axe they put in my hands was not just a tool. It was a lesson. They were saying, we believe you are better than your worst moment. We believe you can choose to build instead of destroy. And they were right. Most of us did. He paused, looking at his hands. Builder's hands. I came to Canada as a prisoner of war. I became a prisoner of conscience, imprisoned by the realization of what my country had done, what I had believed. But that prison freed me. Strange, is it not? The real captivity was back in Germany, believing the lies. The real freedom was here, in a camp surrounded by forest, holding an axe I could have used as a weapon, but chose to use as a tool. That choice, between weapon and tool, between destruction and creation, that separates civilization from barbarism. The Canadians knew that. It took me years in their prison camp to learn it. Some never learned it at all. The interviewer asked one more question. What should people today learn from your story? Hans smiled, a sad, wise smile. Trust is not weakness. It is strength. The Canadians did not hand out axes because they were foolish. They handed out axes because they understood human nature better than the Nazis did. People respond to how they are treated. Treat them like animals, they behave like animals. Treat them like human beings capable of choice. Most will choose humanity. The strongest prison is ideology. The greatest liberation is realizing you were wrong. And sometimes the path to that realization begins when someone hands you an axe and walks away, trusting you to do the right thing. That trust changes everything. The camera stopped. The interview ended. Hans Müller, former Wehrmacht soldier, former prisoner of war, Canadian citizen, sat in his comfortable house and looked out the window at the life he built with his own hands. He chose well. They all did. The axe was a test. Most passed, and in passing they found freedom they never knew existed. That was the real victory, not of one nation over another, but of humanity over hate, of trust over fear, of building over destroying. The Canadians knew it all along. They just gave their prisoners time to figure it out.